Hello and welcome back to more Bloodborne content, because I just finished playing the game, but I don't want to be done with it. A lot of people make boss tier lists based off of difficulty, but I wanted to go off of stiffness. Why stiffness, you ask? Because there's a lot of ways that can be interpreted. First thing up for stiffness is how stiff the boss can make you with Rigor Mortis, aka kill you, you're dead, how stiff your body will be. I wanted to incorporate the music, so we're gonna go off how hard the beat slaps. If the OST is a certified banger, if the boss makes you stiff with fear. Are there even any other ways that something can be stiff or can make you stiff? What's an appropriate way to frame this? The overall visual aesthetic? I can't say visual boner. Can I? Did I? How stiff the visuals, the aesthetic, the experience makes you. With excitement, because you stiffen up like your whole body because you're excited. Not like a... Bonus points can be given at will by whatever consideration. Most likely going to be lore points because Rom's going to need some help, let me tell ya. Stick around for the final scores at the end. I'm going to go in the order that I encountered the boss. My deliberations for each score are going to be based off when I encountered the boss, or when you encounter the boss in your first playthrough. So if I rate the Cleric Beast to be slightly harder than a later on boss that is technically more difficult because you haven't experienced it before, just get mad at me in the comments. I don't know what else to tell you. First up, the Cleric Beast. The first real oh shit moment in Bloodborne, unless you ran into that small little alleyway with the Executioner Grim Reaper type guy that has the giant battle axe and you don't know how to parry yet, like I did. So it was my second oh shit moment. It should have been your first oh shit moment though. Rigor Mortis score, giving it a 4 out of 10. Definitely not the hardest boss in the game by any stretch of the imagination. Visually imposing, but the moveset, not very scary. You can kill the Cleric Beast with the typical skirt around the outside, get behind its ass, and punch it real hard with your weapon of choice. It's the intro boss, and at this point, if you're new to the series or the games in general, I'd only played the Dark Souls games and Sekiro each one time, so I wasn't as familiar with the fighting process as I should have been. Definitely was not aggressive, was a little bit too slow, and got my ass beat a little bit more than I should have. As far as the Cleric Beast soundtrack goes, give this a 7 out of 10. It's sufficiently epic for the situation, and honestly, it's an amazing soundtrack on its own, and the only reason I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 is because there's so many soundtracks for Bloodborne that are just incredible. Like, insanely good. I can't get over how good the songs are. I think I mention it in like 4 or 5 different boss fights. I get distracted by how good the music is and bring it up, and then promptly get punched in the mouth by whatever I'm trying to fight. Not really the greatest characteristic for success, but it does help with my immersion. As far as stiff with fear, giving this a 7 out of 10. Cleric Beast has the best intro into a boss fight in the game. Jumps over the wall onto the bridge. You clearly understand that something is about to go down on this bridge, because once you clear out some of the enemies, it's pretty desolate all of a sudden. This hulking dog-deer hybrid, a deer if you will, jumps over the bridge and is about to just punch you in the face. It's a little bit intimidating for the place you are in the game. And for all these reasons, I'm giving it a 9 out of 10 on the visual boner scale, or overall aesthetic, whatever you prefer to call the category. We might just go with aesthetic going forward. The fight seems epic. It takes place in a cool location. Easily a top 10 anime intro into a fight. And overall, that leaves the Cleric Beast with 27 points out of a potential 40 plus some extra credit if we feel like getting crazy. Next up, Father Gascoigne. Rigor Mortis stiffness, I'm going with a 6 out of 10. This is kind of your welcome to Bloodborne fight, where you should really figure out that you can parry attacks with your gun. A majority of the fight isn't that hard. The real issue's in Phase 3. Father Gascoigne's soundtrack is a certified banger. 10 out of 10. It's awesome. It should be playing behind my voice right now so you can understand how awesome it is. Things escalate when you get into Phase 3, and it adds a horror aspect to it to match with him being a werewolf. And for the aforementioned werewolf reasons, that's why I went with an 8 out of 10 as far as fear goes. Dude makes you stiff with fear. Either that or you panic roll and scream and run away, which is kind of what I did. And by kind, I mean it's exactly what happened. This transformation and kind of enrage mechanic in the encounter had me wary of the fact that this could happen in every single boss fight for the rest of the game. Every single time I was wondering, when is this boss going to transform? When's he going to go absolutely apeshit and try and rip my face off? When are things going to escalate, and when is this fight going to get significantly more difficult? Those were all stuck in my mind because of Father Gascoigne. Missing out on those last couple points because the rest of the fight isn't as difficult by any means. As far as the aesthetic goes, I'm going 8 out of 10. The graveyard setting's really awesome. The soundtrack adds to this. So the soundtrack's actually so awesome that the epicness of it is bleeding into the aesthetic category, because it just all complements each other and wraps together so well into just a tightly knit little bundle of awesomeness. I think the character is well designed. At the start, he's very obviously a hunter. I don't 100% know the lore about how he just instantly turns into a werewolf, but he is very in tune with his beasthood apparently, and is not afraid to flaunt it. Father Gascoigne's going to be our first boss to get some bonus points. 4 points total, 2 points for each murdered parent, giving Father Gascoigne a total of 36 points. He's got the incredibly sad story behind him where you go and talk to his daughter who asks you to bring him the music box and find the red brooch that her mother was wearing because it's the only thing that kind of allows Father Gascoigne to keep his sanity. Yeah, that was a little bit of a vibe assassin type moment. I'm saying for me, for like the little girl, it was probably slightly worse with her parents. And on that happy note, we'll move to the Bloodstarved Beast. I'm going to assume that I'm not the only person that either did or came close to running out of blood vials on this boss, or at least that's what I and at least one of my friends experienced. I know this boss made that specific friend and a lot of other people quit Bloodborne in its entirety. Bloodstarved Beast is the first real moment in the game where it's like, yeah, this game's going to f me up real bad. Physically and mentally. Bloodstarved Beast is going to start out strong with an 8 out of 10 Rigor Mortis score. A little bit of a spoiler for my playthrough, but on my successful attempt against the Bloodstarved Beast, I was down to my last blood vials, so if I had died on it, it would have actually scuffed my recording session, and I would have had to go farm more. That was a truly terrifying experience. I was very upset, very tilted, and somehow managed to persevere, like keeping just an absolute thread of sanity. I know Fromsoft games are really supposed to like push you to your limit, and I hadn't really truly had that experience until the Bloodstarved Beast. Definitely had some rage moments, but I was legitimately scared at that point. And for that reason, I'm gonna give the Bloodstarved Beast a 10 for Stiff with Fear. For the point in the game when you encounter him, it's overwhelming, using blood vials and antidotes at the same time. The first half of the fight isn't that bad until the Bloodstarved Beast decides it's going to have a poison aura that just infects you anytime you get near it. So you're trying to use an antidote and a blood vial at the same time with this little deranged golem-like creature wearing curtains on its head charging at you. It's just, it's insane. It's overwhelming. You're not prepared for it at this point. Unfortunately, the soundtrack kind of falls a little flat for me compared to the other ones, so I give this a 4 out of 10. It just wasn't really as epic as I think the moment should have been for me. I'm sure someone's going to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, and I apologize for offending you. As far as aesthetic goes, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. There's a lot of build-up running to a dilapidated church down like a stone path. You walk into this large cathedral knowing you're going to throw down with something that's going to rip your face off, and you see it waddling at you from a long distance away. It's a nice little complete scene that's really emblematic of the fact that you're going to die a lot. Like a lot. I'm done. I have to use the things, man! Like, I can't do anything! I have one antidote left. Oh no, dude, I'm out of, like, potions and bullets again! Oh! I farmed so many! Giving Bloodstarved Beast a total of 30 points. You could have stayed small girl. We could have been friends? Instead, you're now what? A hulking... What are you? You're a deer slash dog? A deer dog? Next up is Vicar Amelia. She starts out as a nice little robed girl and turns into a horrible dog deer monstrosity. She's absolutely massive, has huge reach, and she heals. A fun new mechanic that's introduced. As far as stiffness of rigor mortis, we went with a 6 out of 10 on Vicar Amelia. Her attacks are relatively deadly, but they're kind of easy to dodge. She's kind of like a cleric beast type monster. You basically want to roll around to her ass end and just punch her with your weapon of choice again. The nuance with her is that she has a healing ability. Amelia's teaching you that you need to be aggressive, something that really was not present in the other Fromsoft games. At this point, I was still playing like a Dark Souls type playstyle where I was being very deliberate and trying to choose my attacks. Amelia punishes this by healing up. I gave her a 6 out of 10 because I one-shot her somehow. I think I got a little bit lucky. I never got caught by the grab attack, which I think would have been a swift end to my boy Tommy's life. Stiffness because of fear went with a 6. At this point in the game, I was kind of comfortable with the large hulking beast trying to murder me because that's kind of all of Bloodborne. It's either a hulking beast or a hunter trying to end your existence. The healing mechanic itself wasn't really intrinsically scary. Would have really preferred if she stayed as the little girl because I feel like I would have had an easier fight against her. But even with the transformation, not terribly intimidating. Because this is the same soundtrack as the cleric beast, she also gets a 7 out of 10 for how hard the beat slaps. Can't really give them different scores. That would be unethical to the rating process. And this is an incredibly legitimate and professional grading rubric. So show some respect. Visual aesthetics, 8 out of 10. Boss design's awesome. I mean, pretty much every single boss in this game is incredibly unique. Like, I can't get over it. The music and the boss design in this game in general is just crazy. So keep that in mind with some of these scores. I mean, they're being rated against their peers, some of which are just epic. Between the boss design, the location of the fight, her animations on the healing ability, went with an 8 out of 10 for aesthetics, giving Amelia a total score of 27. So unfortunately for me, the next boss that was encountered was a quadrupedal lightning rod, known as Dark Beast Parl, the skeleton of a saber-toothed tiger infused with lightning that is not supposed to be encountered at this point in the game. But unfortunately, an undead Santa Claus beat the shit out of me, put me in his sack, and took me to some kind of jail, to which I somehow heroically escaped, and the gift that was bestowed upon me was fighting against this piece of shit. Don't worry, none of these personal feelings are going to impact the rating process. As far as Rigor Mortis goes, I went with an 8 out of 10, because he made me run out of blood vials, because he beat the shit out of me. From what I understand, this is kind of like a DPS check fight, so if you have a lot of damage and can break all of his limbs, it's a pretty easy fight. If you don't, and you perhaps, I don't know, encounter him early with like a +2 whip, for example, he'll eat you alive because he does an insane amount of damage, is incredibly mobile. Oh, and he has an ally called the camera, both of which will work in tandem to double team you until you're out of blood vials and sobbing. None of those things happen to me. It's fine. To piggyback off all those wonderful facts, giving him a 9 out of 10 for how stiff with fear will make you. If you understand how to take him out and be really aggressive and break all of his limbs, then it's not very bad. If you don't, you're gonna have a really terrible time because he's incredibly mobile, he's fast, he does a lot of damage. All the things you don't really want to encounter at this point in the game, or at least when I encountered him. The soundtrack is honestly the most disappointing out of all of them for me, and I gave it a 2 out of 10. It doesn't really fit with the encounter as much as I'd like it to, and this is coming from someone who has no real authority to speak about the quality of music, so take it with a grain of salt. It just didn't really do it for me. As far as the overall aesthetics go, I think the boss looks pretty cool. The room itself isn't really that crazy. Oh yeah, and once you're finally able to best this guy who comes from the horror version of Night at the Museum, you're gifted with the ability to open a door that leads you back to where you were before. Have you looking around the little werewolf town that you were in previously wondering, what did I do wrong? Why did I just experience this? And have you question life in general. 0 out of 10, would not recommend. Overall, that gives Dark Beast Parallel a 24. And as I continue experiencing bosses, not in the way that Miyazaki intended me to, I ran into Amygdala next. Amygdalas are some kind of celestial being that you can only see if your insight's high enough, or if you destroy Rom and lift the facade that is the existence that is life in Bloodborne, so you can see all the terrible Spider-Man / scalp massager hybrid type things clinging to walls. And similar to those scalp massagers, Amygdala is a little off-putting when you first see it, but then you find out that being in the middle of one isn't really that scary after all. I was gonna give it a low score, like a 4 out of 10 for Rigor Mortis and its propensity to kill you, but then I remembered when you get its health low, it rips off its own arms and tries to beat you to death with them. It's one of the most metal things that I've ever seen in a boss fight. He literally rips off his own arms. His arm economy is so high that he can spare them as weapons to try and beat the shit out of you. Actually, I'm going to bump him up to 7. I'm going to give him an extra point for how hard he is to hit with Molotovs despite being the size of a building. I don't know if that's a feature specific to him or if my character Tommy is the only noodle arm protagonist in Bloodborne, but I couldn't hit him with a Molotov. It should be impossible to miss him. It makes no sense. For his overwhelming size and the aforementioned arms as weapons thing, I'm going to go with a 7 out of 10 for Fear Stiffness. As far as the soundtrack goes, 7 out of 10. I think it fits the encounter. It's sufficiently epic. It fits the area. For the overall aesthetics, I'm going to go with only a 4 for this one because he resides in the Nightmare Frontier, and that area made me want to quit the game. It's filled with these brain eyeball people who suck your sanity out of your skull, and you only get the incredibly unpleasant experience of seeing them if you make it past all of the sloths throwing untextured boulders at you while you're wading through a poison lake and fighting off like sea slugs. It's awful. Definitely my least favorite area in the game. And overall, that puts our friend Amygdala at 25. Next up is the Witches of Hemwick. At first, when you enter the arena, you think the boss is one of those little scythe creatures that you've been encountering in the area already. And then you kill it and the health bar doesn't change and you kind of look around wondering what's going on. And honestly, that's pretty emblematic of the whole experience of this fight. You'll eventually see like a little sparkle and run over to the area, and this old woman covered in eyeballs will appear. She doesn't really fight back at first, and you just kind of beat the shit out of her. And that's most of the fight. It's called the Witches of Hemwick because there's actually 2 of them. And if you're lucky like me, you'll find the second witch by accident and kind of knock their health bars down in unison. Apparently this fight can get a little difficult if you don't do that. For my personal experience, I'm gonna give the Rigor Mortis score 1 out of 10. I basically instantly killed both of them. Faced no real challenge during the encounter. I was possibly a little bit over leveled because I had just bested Amygdala and Dark Beast Parl before beating the shit out of these old women. So that probably contributed to my success. Also 1 out of 10 for the Fear Stiffness grade. They're not exactly the most imposing creatures in Bloodborne. They're not even the scariest old women, despite their aesthetic of being covered in eyeballs. Witch of Hemwick soundtrack, 3 out of 10. It goes slightly harder than the encounter is. And for the visual aesthetic, I'm gonna give them a 5 out of 10, just because of all the eyeballs they have on them. It is legitimately creepy that both of them collect eyeballs, and I think if the encounter was a little bit more difficult, that would be a little bit more scary and cool as far as a horror aesthetic goes. So kind of being a little lenient in that category, so we can at least get the witches up to double digits with a score of 10. Next up, we have 3 lads that are still out living out their Lord of the Ring glory days. The Shadow of Yharnam kind of carries out the normal 3-person crowd control fight construction where you have a melee, a caster, and then some kind of miscellaneous like hybrid type guy. For the Rigor Mortis score, I gave this a 3 out of 10. I know this is going to sound low to a lot of people, but fights like these play into that comfortable like Dark Souls style that I was used to, and I'm also just exceptional when handling 3 lads. If it's 1 or 2 monsters or bosses, it's usually pretty challenging. But when it's 3, for some reason I just go into like my flow state and I can just handle anything that's thrown at me, even if everything's coming at me from every direction. Yeah, as far as the fear aspect goes, I gave them a 6 out of 10. A little bit on the lower end because they get made into normal monsters later on in the game, and if a boss gets made into a normal monster at some point, it can't be that scary. You can't give it a 10 out of 10. What gave them a little bit more credit is they literally have snakes shooting out of every single one of their orifices, and that's reasonably terrifying. And when you get their health low, or the last one's health low, not really sure since I one-shot it. Giant snakes come out of the ground and try and murder you. Luckily, also adept at handling giant snakes. Haha, yeah, big flex. Soundtrack, I'm giving a 6 out of 10. It's kind of average in the scope of the Bloodborne soundtracks. It's definitely nice and fits the fight, but I can't put it in like that top tier of Bloodborne soundtracks. For the visual aesthetic, 4 out of 10. I think the snakes and everything are cool, but once again, and you may dislike this, I'm taking away some points for the area that they're in. The woods full of snakes, terrible. Second least favorite area in the game, behind Sloth Boulder Poisonville, aka the Nightmare Frontier. That leaves the Shadow Yharnam with an overall score of 19. Next up is Martyr Ligarius. This boss was the first one that made me truly lose my shit in this game. I raged so hard. No, dude. No, don't! Why did you roll that way? I hit left while I was facing the fucking wall! Oh, man! I can't stand anything right now. Oh, dude. I'm actually so tilted right now. This was a legitimately challenging fight. He's got spells if you're trying to be far away. He's formidable in melee combat. Oh, he's also wielding potentially the toughest character in the game to beat, his sword. Which, if you're like me and just sprint away when he summons the cloud of blades at you and don't notice his sword on the ground until, like, I don't know, the 12th attempt, the fight's significantly harder with swords flying at you the entire time. Don't recommend. Rigor Mortis score, 9 out of 10. His spells hit insanely hard, his physical abilities hit insanely hard, and as I learned afterwards, you can stagger him while he's casting and doing some of these other things. But if you don't know these things, the fight's really difficult, and if you don't know the gimmick around his sword and hitting it, the fight's extremely difficult. And that's the fight that I experienced. I'm sure some people who were smart enough to backstab him while he's casting and knew to immediately shoot his sword had a much more pleasant experience with this guy than I did. Oh, and I'm sure you also didn't accidentally roll off the roof once. I'm fine. I'm okay. My fear grade for him is a 9 out of 10. Between the dangerous spells, the melee, and the swords flying at you, it's just a no-brainer for me. I had a straight up bad time with this guy. Soundtrack, I'm giving a 7 out of 10. It slaps almost as hard as he does. And for visual aesthetics, I'm giving a 7 out of 10 as well. I mean, he basically looks like Vendrick that graduated from Hogwarts. Like, he's pretty badass. You're fighting him on top of a cathedral. There's a lot of cathedrals now that I'm kind of repeating that over and over again. But he's also guarding the Vile Blood Queen, which is pretty cool. He sacrificed himself to make sure she stayed hidden. Overall, it's just a really cool encounter once you get past the raging. Well, leaves him with an overall score of 32, which is pretty damn high, but I think he deserves it. Ah, yes. Rom the Vacuous Spider. With the heavy lore implications of this fight, you would think I would give it a pretty high score. But unfortunately, running around and killing little spiders for 48 minutes straight is incredibly mind-numbing. The hardest part of this fight is actually not falling asleep while doing it. I would legitimately rather be stuck in traffic. And for that, we'll give it a 3 out of 10 for Rigor Mortis. Not because it'll make you stiff from a death perspective, but you'll be stiff with boredom. As far as fear goes, Rom, who doesn't attack for half the fight and then just tries to drop rocks on your head that you can sprint away from, is an imposing 0 out of 10. The soundtrack gets a 3 out of 10. It's slightly more engaging than the encounter is, but I already kind of gave it the bonus boredom points. Aesthetically, a 3 out of 10 as well. For Rom almost being a great one, the fight's kind of underwhelming from a visual perspective. I wish Rom looked cooler. I mean, she's basically just like a rock that you find in a stream that's grown some moss on it and has legs for some reason. It's like a hermit crab. Like if a hermit crab found a rock that had moss on it, that would be Rom. I'm gonna give her 6 bonus points just for the lore implications, since she's placed an area-wide veil over everyone's eyes, shielding them from the terrible life and existence that is old Yarnum. So with those 6 bonus points, she gets up to the incredibly high score of 15. The One Reborn. The first of the kind of evil infant incarnate hostile baby type creatures that you'll run into in Bloodborne. Rigor Mortis score, we're going with 2 out of 10. The fight's made more difficult by witches that are up top on these balconies shooting fireballs at you. Apparently you can go up and kill them. I didn't do that, and I still slapped the shit out of this boss. The most difficult part about the boss is that you can't really find its ass. It just has 76,000 feet surrounding it. From what I understand, I think it's body parts that were collected by the evil Santa Clauses. I don't know who took responsibility for the design, implementation, and execution, but they need to be fired. As far as the fear rating goes, 3 out of 10, not very imposing. However, if you have a foot phobia, it does bump up to 12 because of the number of feet that are on the side of this thing that really seem to serve no purpose. They're just randomly and unnervingly kicking the air. I actually gave the soundtrack a 7 out of 10. It slaps way harder than the boss fight is. I think it does fit the area well though. The area leading up to the One Reborn is actually pretty challenging and perilous, and I think the theme song fits that well. As far as visual aesthetic goes, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. And much like the fear rating, this bumps up to 12 if you have a foot fetish. So really your experience with this fight varies greatly on your perspective on feet in general. No kink shame on this channel. Live your life. That leaves the One Reborn at a total of 15 points. The score would be bumped up to 24 if you have a particularly polarizing view of feet. And that wraps up the first half of the bosses. Here are the current standings halfway through the list. What do you think of the ratings? Did my scores line up with your opinions? Let me know in the comments. If you have any predictions for part 2, drop them in the comments as well. I'd love to see them. If you enjoyed that, like the video, subscribe so you don't miss the second half of the tier list, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.